Hi, my name is Joe Jackson. I'm an interviewer, journalist, author, and a broadcaster. I've also recently begun to do a podcast series called The Joe Jackson Interviews. It's based on roughly 1,400 interviews I did over more than 30 years while working for all the major media outlets in Ireland. But as of today, July the 26th, 2020, not all the tapes are edited and processed in terms of digitisation. Even so, yesterday Peter Green died, and I've loved Green's work since I was a kid who related to those lines, "I can't sing, I ain't pretty, and my legs are thin." And I loved and related to the aching at the soul of songs like "Need Your Love So Bad," "Man of the World," and in fact, the blues cry in much of the singing and playing of Peter Green. So in early 1993, when I was doing a weekly interview slot for the Irish Times, it was a pure blues rock and roll fan's delight for me to be able to sit down and talk with Mick Fleetwood in a Dublin hotel. That tape isn't processed, and I will turn it into a podcast at a later date. Yet today, a day after Peter's death, I will mark his passing and celebrate his memory and mourn his death this way, via a podcast, and by sharing with anyone who feels as I do today in terms of Green's death, the part of my chat with Mick Fleetwood about the Elmore James mimicking blues bass of the original Fleetwood Mac, how that then evolved into something symphonic and shatteringly brilliant, and increasingly demented, courtesy of the ever-darkening psyche of Peter Green. This part of our chat ends abruptly, but then so did Peter's life. So can life itself during a pandemic. Stay safe, but now let's go back to 1993. I'm going to bounce questions. There's a rough chronological sequence to the questions, but I'm trying to avoid just going boringly through it, and it's tied into the CD set. So the first single on it is kind of reflects what you have described as the fascination with Elmore James, which was running through London at the time, plus Jeremy's own particular fascination. Why is it credited to Spencer?
Why is it credited?
Yeah, isn't it Elmore James? It's a variation on Elmore James's.
Well, yeah, his that was one of Jeremy's songs. But Jeremy absolutely was.
And it's not a direct lift of an Elmore James lyric and melody, is it?
I would say it is. Yeah, right. I would say it's very close to a.
Because really, you dust my broom, you're straight in there, you
know. No. I mean, all we did on the first album, for instance, there is. Actually, one thing that was turned out to be, for me, actually a shame. We couldn't put the Elmore James titles on this album, unfortunately, because the publisher, when you're doing a box set like this, which is very boring, but you have to do what's called a 3/4 rate, where the publisher, in essence, agrees to take a lesser thing because there's so many songs,
right?
And there's like a blanket. Deal done, and for whatever reasons, which I thought was insane, they wouldn't agree to it, so we couldn't use. Not that with your question it matters, but I mean I feel that the stuff that's on there certainly demonstrates what Jeremy was all about.
Sure.
But that was a shame. But certainly Fleetwood Mac was Elmore James.
Sure. Yeah, but not the only band. You say he was a dominant influence over a lot of musicians at that point in London.
Yeah, but most certainly, as far as I'm aware, the people who are literally doing, the Shake Your Money Makers, one after the other, was Fleetwood Mac.
Okay,
and hence Jeremy Spencer.
Right. There are two readings. There are two views of that. I mean, black revisionists or activists would say that it's the white bands reappropriating black culture. Other people would suggest that bands like Fleetwood Mac in particular took a basic blues format, and whether it was adding strings to Need Your Love So Bad or being influenced by Ralph Vaughan Williams on the second part of Oh Well, that you pushed the blues in places blacks weren't doing and hadn't done and mightn't have done if whites hadn't taken over. You know what I mean?
All I can say about certainly something that became apparent to me and John when we listened to like tons of stuff which didn't make it because there's just not enough room on here. In fact, there should be another box set of some of the old stuff that we found that it wasn't appropriate and there wasn't room, just because of the nature of what we were doing. We're trying to cover the whole gambit. But I mean, we made no bones about it. If I remember correctly, which is I think the case, we made a stalwart attempt, if you like, to not only, I suppose, in our own naive way, educate people into this is the stuff to listen to. This is where all our heroes were not taking a back seat. In Elmore James's situation, for instance, that's what we were doing. We were literally copying Elmore James verbatim. And Jeremy was a clone.
Sure.
And a very good one, I might add. And Jeremy didn't develop into anything else, really. He certainly had his next love was revamping rock and roll.
Do what?
Well,
there's a trace of that in the CD set too, on the string along.
Yeah. And again, he did that very well. And that because Jeremy, if you like, didn't develop, was the reason Peter, ostensibly, and certainly with my support, brought Danny Kerwin into the band. And of course, at that point, you can see them play on the development of a strict blues format changing. And besides that, Peter had already, before Fleetwood Mac was formed, in my opinion, with the likes of the Supernatural, with John Mayall, his little niche was already starting to be cut out. So
how do you view it like?
Jeremy was a lazy bugger, you know.
But do you encounter that from blacks who say it was just appropriation of black culture?
What I encounter
or praise because you extended it further.
Luckily, because I seriously do feel that we were really bloody good, actually.
But the two things
they acknowledge that, especially Peter Green. I mean, he to this day, not only with white musicians, this terrible white and black, but Buddy Guy, B.B. King, and B.B. I can't say I see him every day for a cup of tea, but I do know him. Well, he will always ask after Peter. Has nothing but absolute respect for Peter he was the guy.
Well, B.B. King would very much identify, and maybe has aspired towards, the blending of orchestras with blues, a symphonical approach. Ralph Vaughan Williams.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, so they certainly, and I don't see that often credited, I only thought of it last night, that classical, maybe it wasn't cool for rock critics to see the connections, but you have it in the book, to take influences from those areas that you would not expect guitarist, blues bass band in the 60s to be listening to Ralph Vaughan Williams.
That's true.
And an orchestral counterpoint. I mean, was there any tension? Because blues purists would have felt that an orchestral counterpoint to two guitars and one guitar or a vocalist is off the wall, or is impurifying the form.
Was there any tension? Yeah, I suppose there was. I mean, in terms of people who followed Fleetwood Mac. But that was part and parcel of it. All happened at the same time because people, staunch followers and they were incredible, and a lot of them are still around to this day.
Fans,
they were ruffled, but they didn't go away. They were still they were still there shouting out, "What's all this crap with all albatross?" and
with strings and
and why can't we do that? And
where's my money, man?
But they were still there, So we faced all that sort of thing of, are you sold out?
Even at that point, 68, 69, right? 69,
but I mean, hey, don't get me wrong. I mean, we everywhere we went, there were packed houses. It was fantastic. But there were a few of our regulars who didn't understand. And I think they went with, and I think...
the evolution of the band.
Yeah.
How much of that does reflect the kind of fragmented consciousness reflect drug use too? I mean, musical patterns breaking up is this century. So how much of that, like when you created
Fleetwood
music...
Mac at the beginning? No.
Yeah, none of it at that point.
No, I truly don't. None.
Even the Moroccans,
I really don't think so. I mean, we were not heavily... we liked our little hash smoking stuff, but I'm talking about
the early ones.
The early it was a couple of pints and
Was it?
off to the gig.
Right.
It was
So the
not.
but
It was
with,
not a big
but
scene.
with Peter after he had the original LSD trip that you write about.
Well,
Would that not have kind of broken up his consciousness, which then was reflected in a more free-form shape to his music? And I'm not saying it in a negative way. I'm saying
I'm just trying to figure out exactly offhand when exactly
how one followed. Well, the LSD trip was before before the first album, wasn't it? That was have been 66, 67.
Well,
And then the music all followed after that.
It just.
And there's there is.
Hey, you may well be right. It just didn't seem.
And I'm not trying to.
I understand what you're saying. That all I can say is that the whole consciousness of us as friends and the sort of things we did and talked about seemed truly, even to this day, very later. I would say, well, absolutely. The German jet set and the whole.
Yeah, we can talk a bit about that when we get to it. But I'm talking about the early, because the terror that's evoked in Green Man Alicia and all that. Now I know you say that was of a nightmare, but it also could describe something brought on by LSD or by somebody starting to fuck up inside. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but that's the last thing he did with Fleetwood Mac.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
And I agree with you. And I've been. Well, I mean, obviously, I've thought while I was doing this, putting this together, that and the book, it was like literally seeing a life flash in front of you. It did. I think it probably sobered me up, or had something to do with it, because I'm.
Doing the book and having to look at that again?
Well, I think it's weird that by the end of working on those two things, it was not too long after that. In fact, pretty on the nail. I sobered up. There were a couple of other reasons, but I'm just.
Sure.
I think it truly did have something to do with it, because I was emotionally, about a year ago, I felt, hey, I was abusing myself again, badly.
Right.
And I thought about Peter and that specific song, that he was already literally hearing voices, I think, and didn't. And we had not a clue how much trouble this guy was even in those days.
Or where those voices
and I don't think he even. But now I tend to think that he literally was hearing voices, because it was not too long after that, really, that he became a schizophrenic.
Sure. It always reminded me of, I don't know, you probably wouldn't remember, the B-side of a Scott Walker song. It was called The Plague. And it was a song version.
The Walker Brothers guy?
No, just Scott on his own. He did a song
version
of Albert Camus' The Plague, and it always reminded me of Green Man Alicia. It was the terror, the heroin, and kind of his own kind of sexual tensions or whatever.
Yeah.
But both of them made him flip. He's back in the studio, thankfully. It'll be interesting to see what he has to produce. He just got a record deal.
Wow.
And all of his 4 solo albums from the 60s have been reissued in succession this year. He got a great deal.
And he lived here all the time?
He lived between London and Amsterdam. 2 places, quietly, broke, but he's now back in the studio. I'm really delighted. But he'd written from a similar perspective to Peter, the terror of the plague, a man locked in a room, voices, floating shadows coming off the wall. And it was the same. It was around 68, 69. So it was much the same. So the another question. This could be totally off the wall. The song "Black Magic Woman" descended from "I Loved Another Woman." You claim in the book, right? How much, or if any, of the music also evolved from the Robert Johnson fascination with the darkness, the devil, Satanism, if ever? Was that ever
with Peter?
Peter, and later with the band, because you have a lot of things.
Preface it, because Peter was he was the boss,
All right. Because it is the Robert Johnson decor of blues.
Yeah, it is. I think those influences absolutely, definitely were there.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I'm sure that comment that you're making. These are really astute observations, actually. That it was strange for me, you see. I mean, I was at the time, very uneducated.
Right.
I was just a little drummer that played a certain way. So
right. Virgin.
So Peter was the man who had become very aware of a whole genre of music that he very literally not only identified, that he lived. And I think that it stands the test of time that it was a very real thing. It was past the mimic syndrome. It was a very deep emotional connection with something which basically said, thank God I found something that I personally identify with, because I think Peter is and was an extremely, I don't know whether you ever met Peter, but
never did, no.
If you walked in the room now, you'd know about it. Even if he was a little bit like he can be now, it's still, there's a tremendous heaviness, and it got heavier and heavier and heavier at present, and this is what he was carrying around when he was, if you like, identifying people like Robert Johnson.
But how much of it was any of it thanks Satan? I mean, was any of it practicing in the occult study? Was it at that point?
But I think he...
Because a lot of... I talked with Rory Gallagher, you know our Rory, very recently.
Sure.
And Rory described a wonderful incident. He said that when he was he was first touring, he used to play a reel-to-reel tape, it probably would have been at that time, of Robert Johnson's best songs on a little machine. And he played it 5 nights in succession on his own in his hotel room. And on the 5th night, now some of this may be Catholic Irish fear, he felt that he was being sucked into something emotionally that he became suddenly terrified of. And that's as far as he wanted to tell me. But he said he felt like he was... Now, whether that was his concept of it, that he's pulled away. But he said there are a lot of blues musicians in particular, and maybe in America, 'cause I've been in Memphis and those places, where people feel this is as much a part of the culture we have to explore if we want to get to the core of the music. So I'm wondering how much of that carried over.
I have to say that I was very unaware of that. It was never a point of
departure,
realization, or discussion, or anything else. Whether Peter inadvertently tripped into that, I tend not to think so.
Okay.
But the more that you're sort of bringing it up, I
wonder.
Well, you have to think of all the songs. Peter's. If you look through his dossier, there's a lot of
those
dark
connotations. Whatever darkness
things in there.
Whatever darkness he's tapping into, it's coming from somewhere down there.
Well, he
or down there.
Yes, you see. I mean, this is an interesting. You're making me think now. I have to say that just in terms of the band and me being, I was really close to Peter.
Yeah.
Though he had two sides, and one side did take over.
Sure.
And that was something which, if you like, to me, he ended up flipping out.
Sure.
Whether this would have happened normally without being involved, who knows? Or without the excursions on acid, which.
But isn't that the key question? Because you often do see it attributed just to LSD, which is like the symptom. It's like, what does LSD or did LSD trigger in Peter Green? If he has become the classic rock and roll casualty in that sense, you have to say, what was it the drug connected within him? Because you and I know that there are countless people who have taken or who took it for years and were not sent into that kind of catatonia or depression or schizophrenia. So it had to be something within him rather than the imposition of LSD. Unless
I think so. I personally with the mind that it's just a question of saying, yes, it might have been in him, but it might never have come out. This guy might have been able to function far better in this world had X, Y, and Z not happened. And I believe that too. But the real cruel way of looking at it, I always think that whatever's in there is in there anyhow. And it's like, would Danny Kerwin have become a raging alcoholic? I think probably yes. I'm on the other breath I bet this sped it along a bit, putting this guy who's just not cut out to being in this business, and I think that's true too.
Hi, Joe Jackson here again. I thank you for listening to this edition of the Joe Jackson Interviews podcast. More can be heard on my website, joejacksoninterviewer.com.